Hello, fellow Beatle fans, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. Today we're going to go to the book Living the Beatle Legend by Kenneth Womack. It's the untold story of Mal Evans. He was the road manager for the Beatles, and I'm sure we'll feel like we're traveling around with the Beatles in this book. I've always had a curiosity about him before I knew his name. Mal would appear around the Beatles and was pictured with them too. The book was written in 2023, so it's a pretty current book, but I don't mind the date of any Beatles book. I kind of like the book to be older because memories are fresher, and that puts people into those dates without the clouding of time. So let's see what we can find out today. The book begins with a foreword by Mal Evans' son, Gary, and this is important because it sets the stage for how the book came to be and how it almost wasn't ever going to be until a temporary worker found Mal's collection. Gary said his father worked for years filling up his diaries and notebooks with his drawings and recollections. He took photographs and saved a lot of items. In 1975, Mal sat down to compose his memoir for Grosset and Dunlap. He found it difficult to take up a pen and capture his thoughts. He was helped by a stenographer who transcribed his words to the letter. And Ringo Starr had also given him some sage advice. If you don't tell the truth, don't bother doing it. And so Dad did, according to Gary. On January the 4th, 1976, Gary stated when his father couldn't stomach the act of living another day, his father orchestrated his demise in a Los Angeles duplex. He left behind the fruits of decades of collecting, along with a full draft of his memoir, which he planned to call Living the Beatles Legend, 200 Miles to Go. He had even gone so far as to plot out the book's illustrations with the assistance of a friend who had served as an art director, and mocked up a couple of cover ideas. Gary said his dad's death threw everything into disarray. Grosset and Dunlap made attempts to get Living the Beatles Legend published, but Gary said his mother, Lily, understandably distraught over her estranged husband's tragic death, simply wanted his collection to be returned to the family back in England so that they could sort things out for themselves. And they learned later that in the days after his father died in Los Angeles, Grosset and Dunlap transported the materials from L.A. to New York City, and they were eventually placed in a storage room in the basement of the New York Life building. And they sat there for more than a dozen years. Wow, that's a long time. And they were rescued from the garbage heap by a temporary worker named Lena Cuddy, and thank God for her. She discovered Mal's materials along with diaries, the photographs, and the memoir. She knew she was in the presence of a most unusual archive. She tried to let the publishing company know about it, and no one was listening. Cuddy took upon herself to march uptown to the Dakota, where she left a note for Yoko Ono, one of the few genuine heroes in the strange progress of Gary's father's artifacts. In short order, Yoko alerted Neil Espinal, and that Gary said that was my dad's counterpart during the Beatle years. With the assistance of some shrewd Apple lawyering, Neil saw to it that the collection was finally delivered to Gary and his family home in 1988. Gary said for several years his dad's manuscripts and memorabilia was stored up in the attic. He would periodically dip into them and reacquaint himself with the person he lost when he was 14. Thumbing through the materials reminded him of why he loved his father so dearly, in spite of the flaws that drove him away from the family and led to his death at the age of 40. The family struggled with the idea of sharing Mal's story, and then, in 2004, a forger created an international sensation when he claimed to possess Dad's collection and a suitcase full of artifacts he had discovered in an Australian flea market. The news was quickly picked up and shared across the globe with much fanfare before it was proven to be a hoax. Gary and his mother consented to a 2005 interview with Sunday Times magazine to stop all the confusion. Gary crossed paths with filmmaker and Beatles aficionado Simon Weitzman, who was on a similar mission. Gary and Simon formed a friendship, and Gary confided that he found it a challenge of sharing his dad's story with the world. Simon said he knew just the guy to make it happen. Through Simon, Gary met Ken Womack through a Zoom call in 2020, during the first few months of the COVID-19 pandemic. Ken had written several books about the Beatles, and Simon trusted him implicitly. Gary said he knew he was the right person to collaborate his dad's story with the historical integrity it required. Gary said they worked with HarperCollins and are proud to share the present book with you, a full-length biography detailing his dad's life with and without the Beatles. Gary said his father meant the world to him. He was his hero, and he felt that Ken showed him that Mal Evans was the Beatles' greatest friend. Mal Evans was 27 when he joined up with the Beatles. He was the new guy, but he was also the old guy. He had 5 years on John Lennon and Ringo Starr, and even more on Paul McCartney, who turned 20 back in June, and George Harrison, still a teenager at 19. Mal had a real job making money as a telecommunications engineer for the General Post Office, and he had a home and a family too. He had his beloved wife Lily, and they lived in Liverpool's Allerton district, where they were raising their 15-month-old son, Gary. Mal was a big man. He was 6 feet 3 inches tall, and he was taller than most of the people he worked with. He was built, too. He was a dedicated cyclist and a swimmer. Mal would bike for hours, full days, on the rural outskirts of Liverpool, and he loved to swim, too. He would swim in the freezing Irish Sea to a country lake and to a motel pool, and he would do the breaststroke to get more of a workout than just splashing around. Mal got the job as the Beatles' Ford Thames van driver by fate. Neil Espinal was the Beatles' full-time road manager. He came down with the flu, and it was during the last week in December, and a blizzard had swept across southwestern England and Wales, leaving the snowdrift of up to 20 feet in its wake. The weather emergency turned into a big freeze, with dangerously low temperatures in Great Britain throughout January. The Beatles had just come out with their second single, Please Please Me, released January 11th. January 19th, the Beatles performed the song on the popular Saturday night television program, Thank Your Lucky Stars. That night, the Beatles were on the lowest rung on a 7-act bill, but that wasn't for long. The single was racing up the charts, and Epstein had booked some radio and television appearances, which meant they needed to go to London on the day after their Thank Your Lucky Stars appearance. When Neil woke up the next day after the show, he was feverish. He went to the Beatles' gig at Liverpool's Cavern Club, and he announced that he wasn't able to drive them to London. The Beatles didn't have much sympathy for him, saying, "Well, you'll have to get somebody else, won't you?" And Neil didn't know who he could get. Neil said, "I went up the cavern steps into Matthew Street just to get some fresh air," and Mal was standing there. Mal and Lily had just arrived at the cavern that night. He had worked as a part-time bouncer at the basement club, and he was a familiar presence to the Beatles and their crowd of cave dwellers. Mal had worked as a part-time bouncer at the basement club, but he was a familiar presence to the Beatles and their crowd of cave dwellers. That's the title that the DJ Bob Wooler had given the cavern regulars. Neil asked Mal what was he doing for the next few days. He asked him if he would like to drive the Beatles to London. So Mal felt it was a no-brainer. Being near the action was what had drawn him to the cavern in the first place. Mal was an Elvis Presley fan, and he loved being around the Beatles. They would swap stories about the King, and Mal was becoming friends with George. Mal would request Elvis tunes. He loved the song, I Forgot to Remember to Forget. And George would change the lyrics on purpose, singing, I'm so bloody lonely, in place of I'm so blue and lonely. The bandmates would introduce their songs by Mal by altering his name. This one's for malcontent, or this one's for malfunctioning, or this one's for Malodorous. Mal was good-natured, and he took it all in stride, and he had quickly accepted Neil's offer. He would have to take several days off from work to make the trip. He also knew the weather would be bad, and more importantly, he knew that the trip was very important for Brian and the Beatles. The Beatles' first trip to London hadn't gone well. They had a lukewarm appearance at Radio Luxembourg's Friday Spectacular program, and they decided to make an unscheduled stop at the offices of London's journalists. By the time they arrived at NME, the New Musical Express on Denmark Street, the Beatles were asked by Alan Smith, who was a Liverpudlian journalist, about their impression of Londoners. Not much, they told him. If they know you come from the north, they don't want to know. And Brian wanted to make the most of their upcoming trip. He planned an aggressive itinerary for January 1963, including a whirlwind press tour and no fewer than 3 pre-recorded radio spots. Mal had never driven in central London before, It would be difficult. He was from the north and was unfamiliar with the city's confusing matrix of narrow back streets and thoroughfares, and the unpredictable traffic pattern. Ma was worried about the state of the Beatles' van. He left his own car in West Derby, where Neil rented a room above Mona Best's basement, Casbah Coffee Club, and Ma drove the Ford Thames van to his hillside home in Liverpool's Moseley Hills district. He found out on a 5-mile trip the van was missing one cylinder, and the next morning Ma took the van to a garage in Crosby, where a mechanic remedied the cylinder problem. When the Beatles and Ma started the trip to London, around midday, January 21st, the van's brakes had begun to slip, and the headlights weren't that great at seeing through the fog, but they got there well past dusk at EMI House in time to record the band's sophomore appearance on Friday Spectacular. The theater seated 100. Mostly they were young girls, autograph books in hand, ready to meet their pop idols. The boys were getting ready backstage, and Ma quickly set up their equipment so they could lip-sync renditions of Please Please Me and Ask Me Why. Ma stood at the right side of the stage, a familiar spot for him later. Ma saw how excited the audience was when the announcers started reading out their names, and there was a loud, very genuine applause. It was midnight when Ma and the boys crawled into the Hotel Cavendish on Gower Street. Ma didn't care. He was happy to be sharing a room with Ringo and Paul, while John bunked with George. Ma said later, "The Beatles included me. It was always a case of meals or drinks for 5, making me feel a part of their world." He couldn't believe his good fortune. The next day, January 22nd, things seemed to get better. Ma let the Beatles sleep through breakfast, and he rose early and rounded up coffee and toast to get them ready for the day's breakneck schedule. First, they had to interview Pop-In radio program, broadcast live from the BBC's Paris studio on Regent Street, and Ma got the gear to their next destination. Afterwards, Ma and the boys returned to Paris studio, where they recorded their performance, including a rousing take of Please Please Me for the talent spot, hosted by Gary Marshall. While the group left to meet the Daily Mail's Adrian Mitchell for an interview in Brian Epstein's suite at the posh Mayfair Hotel, Ma stayed at the Paris studio to pack up their gear for the journey back to Liverpool. And then Ma realized, "I didn't have the foggiest idea how to get to the Mayfair." But Ma always had a gift of gab, and he asked a member of the BBC team to provide him with directions, and he wrote it on the back of the band's copy of the radio script. And for Ma, the entire experience was a joy. It was great meeting all the people I'd seen on TV. I was really starstruck. Ma said he took pleasure observing people as the Beatles started to become famous. Ma stated, "I quickly realized, of course, that people were being nice, trying to get to know me, just to use me to get to the Beatles. I soon got to spot them a mile off." So I'm going to end the video here, and I feel the same way beginning this story as I did about Brian Epstein and the book about him, The Man Who Made the Beatles. We have seen them both with the Beatles in pictures and videos, and now we get to learn more about them and how they interacted with the Beatles and helped them in their success. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. And I wish everybody a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.